Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Reporting from Radio Row at the 2015 Conservative Political Action Conference in Washington, D.C., we're pleased to have Erik Telford, president of the Franklin Center for Government and Public Integrity. Erik, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Erik, you're here at CPAC as a media expert and commentator. Let me tee up a question for you. Freedom of the press is enshrined in the Constitution, and skepticism of the press is enshrined in the American character. If you go back and look at the early days, no one took the press seriously. Mark Twain made fun of journalists. It was only a brief period of time after World War II when we went into the Edward R. Murrow, Walter Cronkite stage, where we put journalists on a pedestal. Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man in America. We seem to be reverting back to type, where journalists are held in even lower regard than congressmen. What does that mean?
There are both positive and negative consequences of this. I think it's good to have some skepticism of the press. I think the media has not served the public well. It's not a matter of bias, as a lot of people will beat up on, although that certainly plays a factor.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the bigger problems is the death of mainstream media, the decline of their ability to monetize and provide revenue.
The business model's broken.
Yeah, the kind of investigative reporting that used to happen where people would dig in and really look into a story, uncover information that led to resignations or public policy changes.
It's expensive.
That actually held people accountable. They can't afford it. It doesn't drive clicks. It doesn't drive views. It doesn't drive advertising. That model of journalism is dead. So it's a challenge, but it's a huge opportunity. That means that anybody from a citizen journalist can get out there with the power of the internet and make their voice heard. I think anybody who has those skills, the time and the application. Of course, there's a danger that we're also flooded with a lack of expertise across the board. I think the explosion of information the internet has unleashed causes a lot of skepticism, a lot of distrust. The whole media paradigm has shifted so that we live in a very self-selecting media environment. People choose who they follow on Facebook, who they follow on Twitter, what websites they go to. It's very easy to live in a bubble. So I think most people don't take a big step back and look at not just the death of mainstream media, but the way that people consume information and how that's changed.
So let's separate those two. I want to get back to the way people consume media a second, but let's look at the production of media for a minute, and let's talk a little bit about so-called journalism standards. Back when journalism was monolithic, there were 3 TV networks, there were 3 newspapers that mattered. They pretty much called the shots. There were journalism schools that trained people in the profession, and they supposedly taught them about reporting. How has that changed?
Well, I think now they teach people how to cover Lindsay Lohan's latest high-speed chase on the highway. They can only afford, in those traditional models, the TV stations, the radio stations, and the print publications. If you go to a newsroom, the size it was in the 70s or the 80s, and the number of people that are there now is just a fraction. Tens of thousands of existing reporters across the country have lost their jobs. They're hiring people straight out of college to drive content, not news. It's about anything they can monetize. What's sensational?
Give me eyeballs.
Exactly. What are the Kardashians up to?
So they used to be able to take eyeballs for granted with only 3 TV networks and 3 big city newspapers. Yeah. And yet I'm reading more news now than ever. I'm spending more hours a day reading news, and I'm reading from a more diverse number of sources than I ever have before. And so I'm hearing voices I never would have heard. Why is that a bad thing?
It's a great thing overall. Certainly that opens the door for more voices. Some voices can be less credible than others, but I think it's a net positive. You know, certainly there are wackos that come out of the woodwork that have airtime that otherwise wouldn't have under the old model, but there are also some really great voices. The downfall of Dan Rather would have never happened without the power of the internet. A lot of people remember that happening. They don't remember the intricacies of how it happened.
Sure.
CBS hired credible law firms and investigators to look into it, who produced an audit that basically found like a lack of fact-checking but no ultimate underlying wrongdoing. It was a typewriter expert in Montana.
Yeah, it was about fonts.
Who saw the font and knew that the typesetting used to create the document didn't even... This wasn't caught by the people who were probably paid millions of dollars by CBS. This was a guy in Montana. Now, imagine if this were 1980 and he called CBS and got the front desk guy and he said, hey, I'm a typewriter expert from Montana and blah, blah, blah about the document. I think he would have heard the click of them hanging up pretty quickly. It's only because he had the power of the internet and he commented on a blog that then picked it up and forced the mainstream media to cover it that led to the downfall of Dan Rather. Never would have happened before the internet. And so I think it's the media's job to hold public institutions accountable, and they do a very bad job of even holding themselves accountable. So the power of the internet to hold everyone across the board to account has been tremendous.
So in a sense, we're crowdsourcing our fact-checking.
Exactly.
But there's still a lot of sieving that needs to take place. I mean, you do crowdsource fact-checking and you explode falsities like the vaccine link to autism. And yet that meme lives on forever on the internet. There are still people who will pull up discredited stories, or the UVA Rolling Stone rape hoax is still cited by people as somehow being relevant to something. What do you do about that?
And it's tough because there are two sayings I hear all the time. One is, if you want to know about something, Google it. Trust the internet. Just look it up and see what you can find. And then the other thing is, don't believe everything you read on the internet. So I think it places an additional burden on the news consumer to check the veracity of their information sources. We need to be more informed about where we're getting informed, if that makes sense. And I think that's a challenge. It's something that everybody doesn't do well. We're in the middle of a transformational time in the history of our media landscape. And in a few years, there will be solutions to these current problems that we face. But saying
have to invent them first.
Yes, the saying, we live in interesting times, certainly holds true in this case.
Well, when I see a sensational news story, whether it's emailed to me from a whack job or I pick it up on some fringe account, before I pass it on, I often go to Snopes and say, at least what does Snopes have to say about this? Do you think we'll see more of that in the future?
Oh, I think so. And you talk about crowdsourcing. I'll oftentimes post something on Twitter or Facebook and say, just saw this, what do you know about it? Or some of the listservs I'm on, I'll email it out to. And the ability for other people who are up to speed on things to chime in and steer me toward a better source of information or to verify something is incredible. But again, people don't trust CBS, they don't trust NBC, they don't trust their local newspaper even, but they do trust their friends that they follow on Facebook. They do trust the people they choose to follow on Twitter. I think both as news consumers, it requires us to do more due diligence in checking the veracity of those information sources. But we also have to think about the people when we post something, when we are information sources. We are all news creators. Even if we just post a link to something on our Facebook page, there are people who see that and believe it because they don't check it. So I think it becomes a new civic responsibility that nobody had to ever think about when they were just gossiping by the water cooler. Now we're posting things. We're all online publishers. We all have a platform. We all have a brand, and people trust, based on our personal credibility, what we post and what we not just create, but what we spread.
So taking this back to politics and CPAC, one of the things you look at when you're in this sea of information and disinformation, and various people have various motivations or the attention span to sort this out, is the primacy of narrative. It's actually the synthetic use of, here's this flow of news, and I'm going to put a short story around it, and it's that short story, maybe even a motto that I'm going to push, like, for example, war on women. All of a sudden becomes a meme. It becomes a narrative that gets fed into. The parties seem to have differing abilities to manage this. People on the left seem much better at narrative management than people on the right. Do you think the right will catch up, or will they always be behind because they have fewer experts from that area?
I think in so many realms, when it comes to kind of media savvy and playing the narrative game, or when it comes to, before I came on the show, we were talking about technology, and I think that there's another area of a huge gap between left and right. The problem is, on the right, there's a constant drive to play catch-up, and I think that's the mindset that will be the downfall. If you're always trying to catch up, you're always behind.
And always on the defensive.
Yeah, need to think about how to leapfrog, how to jump ahead. Like in Africa, for example, rather than laying down telephone lines, they jumped immediately to the cellular age and had mobile phones. They skipped an entire generation of technology and got ahead as a continent. We're still trying to build landlines in a cell phone age.
Well, Breitbart seems to be a bit of an outlier. They seem to jump ahead. They have a very hard right story, and they use all the modern techniques of media. How's Breitbart doing?
I think they're doing great, and I think we have a lot of promising outlets. You look at the great reporting and the breaking stories that Breitbart does. You look at websites like IJ Review that drive huge traffic. We don't need to win the game of getting on NBC Nightly News or being quoted in the New York Times to be taken seriously. We can still reach millions and millions of people online. I think we have great conservative infrastructure that gets information out. I think the problem is it exists kind of in a bubble of the people who already agree with what they're reading. So the question is, how do we both create platforms and content that get that message out to non-political people? The average person, some study showed, thinks about politics something like less than 2 minutes a week.
They've got better things to do.
And they're better for it. We're the unhealthy nut jobs that that are spending all of our time focused on this. I think, how do we get issues that they deserve to know about and should be informed about through penetrate that bubble, get it beyond just the crowd of high information consumers on the left or on the right? How do we reach the public at large? And I think that's the biggest challenge ahead.
Well, that gets on to the issue of the consumption side and the vast amount of self-selection that takes place. especially on social media, on Twitter, but also on mainstream media, because now we've become our own editors. More and more people are reading in digital form. I don't read physical paper anymore. And so in many senses, with products like Zeit, I get to be my own editor, so I get to control the flow. People hear echoes of their own ideas. How do you reach across? How do you reach into the middle? How does both sides, not just the right, but as the left, get people to consume more widely?
Right, and I think even in patterns of who watches TV in real time anymore, you're watching it on Hulu or on demand or off of your DVR, the way people...
Well, it's geriatrics that watch TV on...
Yeah.
I mean, look at the commercials. It's
Right.
all, depends and it's self-selective.
Yeah. So I think it is a huge challenge, and that's where I think social media plays a huge role. NBC, CBS, ABC are no longer the three main nightly news stations. They're just content producers, and when it comes to the online sphere, they're on equal footing with a Breitbart. And it's all about you and I and all of your listeners out there. What do we post? Who do we reach? Most of my friends are... I'm from Connecticut. Most of my friends are liberal or just non-political entirely. So the things I post, if I post something that's, red meat conservative, immediately turns them off, or they think, there goes Erik again.
Spouting again.
So I try to post stuff that draws their attention. How do we all think like reporters in writing a headline? And I think the ability of us to reach our friends, our neighbors, our family members, it's actually, I think, something that we should adopt from political tactics and techniques. In 2008, Barack Obama had an iPhone application where rather than getting the robocalls like I got from John McCain, which I knew was
Just
a
turn you
pre-record,
off.
I would hang up immediately. Obama had an app where it pulled all the contacts from your phone book and prioritized them by area code to target people in swing states, and you could call your contacts and personally say, hey, I'm supporting Barack Obama, here's why. And they would answer the call. Most people hang up on robocalls because they know it's a robocall. But if I call my mom, hopefully she's going to take my call. If I call my brother or my best friend, they're probably going to listen to me even if they don't agree with me. So I've at least gotten through to them. And I think that's the challenge. How do you break through and get them to buy in, to pay attention? I think there are huge, huge opportunities ahead with social media and the role that we all play as citizens to inform one another.
What role does humor play in narrative management and political narrative management? We certainly saw Comedy Central really have a big impact on how young people consume their news. Where is that heading in the future?
I think that is the future, infotainment. Most young people were getting and are getting their news from The Daily Show, from The Colbert Report, from John Oliver's HBO show, which has become a new breakout success. And again, that's an area the left is far, far ahead of folks on the right. And I think somebody said it best, I don't recall who, but somebody I saw on TV the other week said that liberals put humor first and are able to be ahead because they're actually funny, and then they have a liberal slant. Conservatives try to put the ideology, the facts, and the logic first, and the humor second. And I think we need to find the talents out there. Certainly there's a question of networks hiring a conservative or having those kind of voices, but even online, I think we can expect to see greater success from across the political spectrum. It has to be funny. If people are taking a break from work, from putting their kids to bed, you've got to entertain them if you want to get their attention. Then you can get the information across to them. So I think humor plays a central role and will be a dominant theme going forward.
And yet conservatives don't seem to go in for stand-up comedy. How many conservative stand-ups do you know?
None I'd pay to see.
Or even cartoonists. I think single-panel cartoonists, going back to the Thomas Nast days who brought down Ross Tweed, have a big role to play. And yet we see so few single-panel cartoonists from the right.
I think what we are seeing is people who are starting to get noticed. They have their own YouTube channel. Maybe they're funny on Twitter. We see entities that have more of a small cult following, like Reason Magazine. Reason TV online has some really funny stuff, some great content, but beyond kind of the libertarian sphere, it doesn't get that penetration, that breakout. So I think there's a nucleus that really needs to be built out to become a full-blown organism, but we do need some more funny people.
So, Erik, how can people learn more about your work?
I'd encourage all of your listeners to check us out at watchdog.org. We've got journalists across the country doing great original investigative reporting, information everybody should know about. So go to watchdog.org, sign up for our emails, and follow us on Facebook.
Erik, great to meet you. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
That was Erik Telford, president of the Franklin Center for Government and Public Integrity, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Check us out on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by realclearmarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Next up, we'll speak with Paul Van Remorto from StandUnited.org, whose new online petition platform looks to add some political diversity to the social media activist movement kicked off by Change.org. Stay tuned.